The moment my grandmother slid her phone across the table and pressed it into my palm, I knew something was wrong. She didn't look at me when she did it. She just kept smiling at my husband's family like nothing had happened, asking my mother-in-law whether the rolls were store-bought or homemade, laughing at something my father-in-law said about the weather. But under the table, her hand found mine, and she curled my fingers around the phone. I looked down at the screen in my lap. Don't drink the wine. Don't let the kids have any juice either, trust me. Don't react. I read it twice, 3 times. My eyes went up to my grandmother's face, but she was already looking away, reaching for the bread basket, completely composed, 78 years old, and the steadiest person in the room. The dinner had been my mother-in-law's idea. She called it a family reconciliation, which was a word she used whenever she wanted something to happen on her terms and needed everyone to feel like it was mutual. We were celebrating my in-laws' 35th wedding anniversary, and she'd insisted we do it at the house, their house out in Maplewood, with the whole family present. That included my grandmother, who had flown in from Savannah specifically because I begged her to come. She was the only person in the world who could make me feel like myself in a room full of people who made me feel like a stranger. I'd married into this family 4 years ago. I want to be fair about it. My husband is a good man, patient, kind, the kind of person who calls his mother every Sunday out of genuine love, not obligation. I fell for that about him before I fell for anything else. But his family had a texture to them that I never fully learned to navigate. They were warm on the surface, the kind of warm that looked exactly like love until you needed something real from them, and then it was gone, replaced by smiles and subject changes, and the sense that you'd asked for too much. His cousin was the variable I'd been dreading. His name was Theodore technically, though he corrected anyone who called him that. He was 34, unmarried, lived 40 minutes away in an apartment his parents had helped him get, and had the particular energy of a man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he genuinely couldn't process evidence to the contrary. He and my husband had grown up close, summers together, same sports teams, family trips to the Outer Banks. But the closeness had curdled somewhere in their late 20s, around the time my husband's career had taken off and Theo's hadn't. The financial stuff had started small. Alone here. Can you cover me this month there? My husband, being who he is, had said yes more times than I could count. The number I knew about was $11,000. I suspected the real number was higher. 6 months ago, something had shifted. Theo had asked for money to cover what he called a bridge investment. He was supposedly buying into a franchise opportunity, a gym concept, and he needed $40,000 by the end of the month or he'd lose his spot. My husband had said no. It was the first time he'd ever said no, and Theo had taken it very, very badly. There had been a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I heard it anyway. Theo had said things that didn't sound like a cousin. They sounded like someone making a threat and dressing it up as a family conversation. My husband had never told his parents what Theo said to him. He didn't want to cause problems. That was the thing about this family. Everyone was always so careful not to cause problems that the problems just kept growing, unaddressed, underneath all that careful warmth. So when my mother-in-law announced the anniversary dinner and said Theo would be there, I felt something cold move through me. My husband said it would be fine. My grandmother, when I called her, said, "I'll be on the first flight." She'd been reading people her entire life. She'd raised 4 children, buried 1 husband, outlasted 2 careers, and had the particular sharpness that comes from having survived more than you plan to. She had a gift for noticing things that other people decided not to notice. I didn't know, sitting across from her at that long dining room table, that she had already noticed something. The table was full. My husband sat to my left. My father-in-law was at the head, telling a story about a road trip they'd taken in 1993 that I'd heard at least 4 times. My mother-in-law was moving back and forth from the kitchen in that way she had, which looked like hospitality but was really control. She liked to be the one deciding what came out and when. Her sister was there with her husband. Two of my husband's other cousins, both quieter than Theo, sat near the end. My grandmother was across from me, and Theo was 3 seats down on my left, next to a girlfriend nobody had met before, a woman named, I think, Christy, who seemed genuinely nice and completely unaware of what she had walked into. The wine had appeared early. My mother-in-law had made a production of it, a bottle of Bordeaux's, supposedly a good one, the kind of thing they brought out when they wanted to signal that this was a real occasion. She'd poured for the adults, and then my father-in-law had done a toast, and everyone had lifted their glasses, and I had lifted mine, and touched it to my lips without drinking. Because of the text, my grandmother had set down her phone, picked up her water glass, and said something cheerful about how she preferred water with dinner these days, doctor's orders, and laughed like it was nothing. I had quietly moved the juice glasses away from my 2 kids under the pretense of rearranging for elbow room, and switched them to water with ice, which they accepted without complaint, because they were 7 and 9, and they had learned, being my children, to be adaptable. The food came out: a roast, potatoes, green beans with almonds, a salad my mother-in-law was particularly proud of. We ate, we talked. My father-in-law finished his road trip story and started another one. Theo was quieter than usual, which I'd noticed but attributed to the tension with my husband. His girlfriend laughed at things a beat too late, which told me she was nervous. And then, about 40 minutes into the meal, my father-in-law reached for his wine glass, took a long sip, and set it down with a slightly odd expression. Not pain, just a flicker of something. He blinked. He said, "Does anyone else feel warm?" My mother-in-law looked at him. "It's a little stuffy. I can open a window." "No, He put one hand on the table. "I feel strange." Everything happened quickly after that. He stood and then he didn't stand. He sort of folded, his hand going to his chest, and my husband was up before anyone else. And then my mother-in-law was screaming and the cousins were pushing back from the table. And I was on my phone calling 911 before I'd consciously decided to. In the chaos, I looked at my grandmother. She was not panicking, she was watching Theo. Theo had stood up with everyone else. He was saying all the right things. "Oh my God," and "Is he okay?" and "Should we call someone?" But his eyes weren't doing what a panicked person's eyes do. They weren't going to his uncle. They were going to the wine bottle. My grandmother saw me watching her. She gave the smallest nod. My father-in-law was conscious. He was confused and sweating, but he was talking, and by the time the paramedics arrived, he was sitting up. They loaded him into the ambulance anyway, and my mother-in-law went with him, and the dinner fell apart completely, the way dinners do when someone nearly collapses at the table. People gathered their things. The cousins helped clear. Theo moved toward the door with his arm around his girlfriend, and I watched my grandmother stand up from her chair with the steady deliberateness of someone who has made a decision. She said loudly enough to carry, "Theo, wait a minute." He turned. His face did something complicated. "Sit down," she said. It wasn't a request. He sat. My husband looked at me. I shook my head slightly. "Let her." My grandmother pulled out her phone. She had photographed the wine bottle, both sides. The label, the cork sitting next to it, the pour level. She'd also, I realized, done something I hadn't seen. She'd taken her own cloth napkin and wrapped it around her wine glass when she set it aside, preserving it without touching the rim, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "I want to know," she said, sitting down across from Theo, her voice perfectly even, "what you put in the wine." The room went very still. Theo said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "You were the last one near that bottle before dinner," she said. "I watched you come in through the kitchen. I watched you set it on the counter. Your uncle poured from that bottle twice. Nobody else had more than a sip." "That's," he laughed, "that defensive laugh men use when they want you to feel crazy. That's insane. You're an old woman making up stories. I'm an old woman who has had a lot of time to learn what guilt looks like, she said. You haven't looked at your uncle once since he went down. Not once. You've looked at the bottle. You've looked at the door. You've looked at your girlfriend, not at him. Christy, his girlfriend, had gone very pale. What did you use? My grandmother said. She said it like she was asking what time it was. Theo pushed back from the table. I'm not sitting here for this. You can leave, she said. The glass is wrapped in my napkin. The bottle has your fingerprints on it, and nobody else's that weren't there from the store, because I watched you handle it. The paramedics have your uncle. Whatever you used will show up in his blood work. She paused, or you can tell me what it was, so when the doctors ask, we have an answer faster. Theo stood there for a long moment. His girlfriend's hand had dropped from his arm. It wasn't supposed to make him sick like that, he said finally. His voice had gone very quiet. It was just supposed to. I just needed more time. He was going to change the will. He told me last month he was changing the will because of the loan thing, because of the money, and I needed more time. He stopped. Nobody in the room was breathing. What did you use? My grandmother said again. Zolpidem, he said. I crushed it up. It was supposed to make him sleepy. I didn't think he'd. How much? He told her. She picked up my phone from the table, the one I'd used to call 911, and dialed again. She told the dispatcher calmly what had been taken, how much, and in what vehicle the patient had left. She read out the address from memory. She hung up. Theo was still standing there, like he couldn't quite process that the thing had happened. My husband was the one who walked to the door and blocked it, not aggressively. He just stood there, arms at his sides, looking at his cousin with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, exactly. Something older and sadder than anger. Sit down, he said. We're going to wait. Theo sat. The police arrived 17 minutes later. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave the entire time. 17 minutes where nobody spoke except my grandmother, who got up quietly and made coffee and set a cup in front of everyone, including Theo, because she was that kind of woman. My father-in-law was treated and released the following morning. The zolpidem at that dosage, combined with the wine, had dropped his blood pressure and sent him into what the doctor described as acute sedation rather than anything structurally dangerous. Terrifying, but survivable. He was groggy and embarrassed, and then, once it was explained what had happened, he was something I don't have a word for. Grief, maybe. The specific grief of a person who discovers that someone they love chose them as a target. Theo was charged. He did not make bail the first night. My mother-in-law called me from the hospital waiting room around midnight. She cried for a long time. I listened. When she stopped, she asked me how we had known, how we had stopped it in time, how nobody else had been hurt. I told her my grandmother had seen something. I told her that Grandma had sent me a text under the table and that I'd believed her without asking why. Because that's what you do when someone who loves you tells you something is wrong. My mother-in-law was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I saw her move the phone. I thought she was texting during dinner, and I was going to say something. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'm glad I didn't. I drove my grandmother back to my house that night. She fell asleep in the passenger seat before we hit the highway, her head against the window, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like she was just sleeping. She looked like a woman who had been to a dinner party. I kept glancing at her at red lights. At some point, she opened one eye and said, Stop looking at me. I'm fine. How did you know? I asked. At dinner, before anything happened. What did you see? She was quiet for a moment. The highway stretched ahead of us, dark and empty. He didn't eat, she said finally. He put food on his plate. He moved it around. He refilled everyone else's wine glass, but he never picked up his own. She shifted in her seat. A man who is trying to relax at a family dinner eats. A man who is waiting for something doesn't. I thought about that for the rest of the drive. When we got to my house and got the kids settled and my grandmother was standing in the guest room doorway in her bathrobe, I hugged her for a long time. She patted my back the way she had when I was small, steady, and rhythmic, like she was reminding me I was solid. "You trusted me," she said. "Of course I did." "That's the thing," she said. "Most people, when someone tells them something is wrong, they look for a reason not to believe it. They don't want the disruption. They don't want to be wrong." She squeezed my arm. "You didn't do that." I thought about the glass I'd lifted and set back down without drinking. The juice I'd moved away from my kids. How easy it would have been to think she was being paranoid, being an old woman with an overactive imagination, and to take a long sip of wine to be polite. "Go to sleep," my grandmother said. "You look terrible." She went inside and closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a minute listening to my house settle around me, the refrigerator humming, the kids breathing through their monitors, my husband's footsteps somewhere downstairs. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a night that had not become something else. My father-in-law is doing well now. He goes to physical therapy on Tuesdays, mostly as a precaution, and he has started calling me on Sundays sometimes, which he never did before. He doesn't say much. He asks about the kids. He laughs more than he used to. He changed his will, and this time he didn't tell Theo in advance. My husband and I don't talk about Theo much. There isn't a lot to say. The legal process is grinding through its stages the way legal processes do, slow and unglamorous, and at the end of it, Theo will face whatever he faces, and that part is out of our hands now. What stays with me is not the trial or the charges or any of the aftermath. What stays with me is the image of my grandmother at that table, perfectly calm, watching a man who thought he was invisible. She flew back to Savannah 2 weeks later. I stood in the departures lane at the airport, and she rolled down the window and pointed her finger at me the way she does. "You listen to your gut," she said, "and you listen to me. In that order, ideally." I laughed. She did not look like she was joking. "Promise me," she said. "I promise." She rolled the window back up. The car pulled forward. I watched it until I couldn't see it anymore, and then I stood there a little longer anyway in the cold exhaust and the noise of the terminal, feeling like myself. I keep coming back to one image from that night. Not my father-in-law folding at the table. Not Theo's face when my grandmother said his name across that quiet room. What I keep coming back to is the wine glass she wrapped in her napkin before anything had happened, before anyone had collapsed, before there was any proof at all. She had already decided to pay attention when the rest of us were still passing the breadbasket. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about protecting people. They talk about being brave, being strong, doing the hard thing. And those matter, but the first step, the one that made everything else possible, was simply noticing. My grandmother walked into that house and she watched. She didn't decide in advance what she would see. She just kept her eyes open while the rest of us were busy being comfortable. Theo had counted on that comfort. He had counted on the fact that family dinners have a certain gravity to them. Everyone wants it to go well, everyone smooths things over. Nobody wants to be the person who causes a scene. He understood that social pressure, and he used it. He sat at that table and performed normalcy well enough that I didn't see it. My husband didn't see it. Nobody saw it. Except one woman who had decided, long before that evening, that she would rather be right than be polite. What I think about, when I think about what she did, is that it wasn't one big act of courage. It was dozens of small ones. Noticing the wine bottle, photographing it quietly, wrapping the glass without drawing attention, sending me a text instead of making a scene. Every one of those decisions required her to trust what she saw over what she was supposed to see. That's harder than it sounds. Most of us have been taught, in one way or another, to second-guess ourselves in the presence of other people's comfort. She never second-guessed herself once. I think about the choices Theo made and I don't feel much anger anymore, mostly just a kind of sadness at the waste of it. He had a family who would have helped him if he'd asked honestly. He had an uncle who had already helped him more times than most people ever get. He chose instead to treat a person's life as a variable in a financial calculation. And what that tells me is that somewhere along the way, he stopped being able to see other people as real. When you can't see other people as real, when you can't capable of almost anything, the opposite of that, what my grandmother showed me, is a kind of moral clarity that doesn't come from rules or fear of consequences. It comes from genuinely caring what happens to the people around you. She didn't wrap that glass to protect herself. She didn't send me that text to be right. She did it because she looked at my father-in-law and she thought, this person matters. His life matters, and I am paying attention. I want to be that kind of person. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I know now what it looks like, and I know the work it takes. The patience, the willingness to sit quietly in an uncomfortable moment and keep watching instead of reaching for the easy explanation. The willingness to say something hard in a room full of people who want you to be quiet. My grandmother would say she didn't do anything exceptional. She would say she just saw what was there. I think seeing what is there, when everything around you is pushing you to look away, might be the most exceptional thing a person can do.